Hello, my friends, and welcome to this episode of Finneran's Wake. I'm joined today by Hector Roos. Hector is a candidate representing the Libertarian Party in Florida's gubernatorial race. Hector, thank you for agreeing to speak with me today. How are you?
Yes, thank you, Daniel. Thank you for your invitation. Doing great.
Of course. So I'd like to begin with a few general, timeless questions about which we human beings will forever be pondering and debating before moving on to some state-specific questions in which Florida voters will be particularly interested. So my first question to you is government necessary?
What is necessary is what the founding fathers have said in this country, right? We need guardians to protect the life, liberty, and property. Notice that it's also interchangeable with the pursuit of happiness. Why is that important? Because at the end of the day, we often have this situation where we cannot, build up to the future. We can't save. In order to build wealth, in other words, you need time. You need time. You need steady currencies. You need protection for yourself and your property. And those guardians can look like a lot of things. They can look like kings. They can look like a homeowners association. They can look like what we have now, or something or they can be something that very simple, direct democracy. If you live in another state, there are often these council meetings that involve everyone who lives in town is welcome to join and make a vote to pass policy, right? So that's it's really just that kind of straightforward approach that people shouldn't, mystify or have this, think that government is some type of mysterious power. It doesn't exist outside of you and me talking and making arrangements for ourselves and for our futures.
So do you think it's in the nature of humans to gather into societies, into political bodies?
Well, that's the lesson of civilization. Literally, the reason why we're here is because people got together and they made arrangements. They obviously had enough time to figure out technology development, to grow, to be productive, and that is to say, to grow crops, to build machines, in order to basically take care of all their needs, and so they can actually aspire to something different. Eventually, we call that in history or sociology, it's called either diversification or specialization of skills, and then you can actually mobilize more complex societies that way. And we simply take it for granted that what these days or what that actually means. That is, and I hope that answers your question.
No, it does. It does, absolutely. Yeah, and it's interesting to know from the libertarian perspective exactly how you regard the necessity of government, because I think sometimes people conflate libertarianism and maybe anarchism. So maybe you can speak to that distinction a little bit, because I think oftentimes the image of a libertarian is that of someone who is completely boundless, completely lawless, completely almost in a libertine state, a pre-civilized state. So maybe you can speak to that distinction a little bit, the distinction between libertarianism, the sort of the ideology of which you're a supporter, and anarchism, which is to say a state without law.
Right. So I'm going to make a practical response to this, because I could make an academic response, and I think people appreciate this, and that is to say that people put up with any situation, no matter how uncomfortable, no matter how disruptive it is to their lives, so long as it doesn't pass a certain line that is their bottom line, right? Which either prompts them to do something like move, like vote with their feet and move to somewhere else far away from that situation, or to actually directly engage with the situation and change it. So that is the premise first. Now what we live in society today in regards to this idea of libertarianism or anarchism or whatever ism is out there, ism just means system, right? the idea that the Libertarian Party simply represents, and particularly the modern Libertarian Party, and I'll get to that because the definition changes in historical context, especially applicability. The Libertarian Party stands for you basically making the decisions for yourself as much as possible, without having somebody else give you a limited set of decisions or options for you to follow. And usually the options can range from this option A, or you leave, to option A through D, or you leave. And sometimes you don't even have the option to leave, depending on the regime. So as people may have remembered what happened 2 years ago with the lockdowns, you did not have an option to leave. So that's and you were stuck with one option: stay home and figure it out first. Figure yourself over the internet what you could do, right? Or through phone, or through get another job that is so quote unquote essential. So that's the practical purpose. Now there are people who do confuse or confound libertarianism, and that means that basically it's a permissionless society that is the aim, or more importantly, consent. That we each of us want to actually do business or interact with it, or freely associate with one another freely without coercion, through consent. So that means that we have to buy in with the choose to buy in every time, rather than be forced or obligated to that set of choices that are presented to us. So that actually ends up looking sometimes, and that's why there's confusion between a libertine lifestyle, which is someone who simply is bucks the common trends in society for social behavior, and the difference between that and a political movement, which simply says that we want people to be able to make decisions for themselves, how they live, how they do their business, with as little outside interference or coercion as possible. And that usually just sums it up right there. I mean, in the historical context, anarchy has meant everything from in, like, for example, we're talking about before the Great Wars, before the big world wars. Anarchism was considered something that was basically anti-royalist. They basically were, they simply wanted to reorganize society entirely away from the social norms, or the structural norms, that is to say, kings, right, or royalty, or feudalism. And today, what does that mean? I mean, that means that the continued breakdown. They will continue to want to break down society in a good way, and all these things are good ideas, right? Today, what does that mean? That means we want to get away from state-controlled money. That we want to have private money, right? Like cryptocurrencies, like Bitcoin, we want to be able to develop, safety, basically all these safety nets that people talk about, whether it's the banking sector, whether it's in education, whether it's in health. All those decisions be able to come at it without a coercive structure to maintain it, which is like taxation. So people, you can see that the modern technology has already enabled a lot of those advents without having to rely on coercion or a monopoly on violence through the state. So without getting into that, so you can see how the application of the word anarchy changes, but it definitely always comes down to how complex and how far removed are the decisions, again, from the person themselves. I hope that's clear enough.
No, yes, very clear. And I appreciate you speaking to these very fundamental ideas, and clarifying any misconceptions that people might have about anarchy on the one side and libertarianism on the other. So you did touch on a few subjects into which I want to delve, from taxation to the pandemic to individual rights. But before we do that, I just want to continue on just a little bit longer with your definition of libertarianism, and just to make it absolutely clear for any listeners out there to whom this concept might be still a little bit unfamiliar. So just briefly, if you could, maybe explain to us the difference between, I don't know, the Republican Party, right? So the traditional parties against which you are now vying. So the Republican Party on the one side and the Democratic Party. So tell us, what distinguishes the Libertarian Party from these two ingrained and historical parties?
Sure. I mean, at the very most, we have to understand that the United States behaves as it's founded as a republic. That means it's founded on the premise of the rule of law is applied equally to everyone, no matter how much money you have, how much influence you exercise, or in other words, whatever station you are in life. And the parties themselves have been just a collection of groups that have, again, let's demystify the process. They're simply groups that exist that coalition together to 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 support certain ideas and candidates for office. Now, it ends up in in today's modern sense when you have these two parties basically acting as political monopolies, where no one else is allowed to. Is very, in other words, they're the ones who control everything, and there's very little participation for anyone else. Uh, they're basically focused nowadays to consolidate, maintaining their power structure, right? And so what we have today is something that devolves into a bit of an oligarchy, where you have the rule of many, just not the rule of the people, right? So in other words, special interests guide the decisions of political parties and the leadership. They certainly fund it, and and so they're the vested power structure in society that tries to influence everything from culture to our basic behaviors, to the food we eat, and to the commercial options we exercise in the market. They attempt to influence it that way and be able to essentially guarantee profit, guarantee their income. And in other words, and it's at the end of the day, it's because it's reactionary. In other words, it responds in a reactionary sense against innovation. That is why people wonder why things haven't improved. Why they've improved in certain areas and they haven't improved in another, right? Or the basic sense of why they've been talking about a cure for cancer for 40 years, or why haven't we seen one out? You see one out, and Joe Biden just mentioned it a couple days ago. So that's really where it comes down to. The Libertarian Party doesn't exist within that framework. Although I will tell you that it was the impetus, it was the leading voice for many years in terms of issues like bodily autonomy. And what I mean by that particularly is like medical marijuana, or the idea that you should be able to choose the healthcare of your choice, right? Not simply state-oriented healthcare or something that's mandated to you through, for example, the American Medical Association, right? That you can actually have this relationship with a healthcare provider, a doctor, a nurse, some type of other someone proficient in the healing arts, right? This has always been a conversation that's existed forever in society, because there's always an interest by those in power to try and preserve what they have through regulatory schemes, or what they call regulatory capture is the formal word. So, what at the end of the day, what does that mean? The conclusion: Republicans and Democrats, they tend to focus their verbiage on or talking points on different sets of subject matters, but they actually end up behaving exactly the same way, because they essentially serve the interests in a sense of patronage to those who pay their bills.
Mm-hmm.
And the Libertarian Party does not. We're not in power. We don't have anything to offer those moneyed interests.
So it seems as though fundamentally the Libertarian Party is less beholden to what you might call those special interests or those oligarchic agenda items, right? To which both of the other parties seem to be so faithfully devoted. Let me ask you, in regard to our founding, to the very origins of our republic, do you think that libertarian ideas, those that you just very briefly outlined, things like freedom of choice and bodily autonomy and the sanctity of the individual, do you think those ideas are more consonant with the ideals of our founding generation?
So you're asking if the Libertarian Party itself is more close in line to the founding fathers, right?
I would say the ideals that you and your libertarian brethren promote, would you say that those ideals are more consonant and similar to those of the founders?
I would tend to think so, but let's put in perspective again that the context of the founding fathers in providing the framework of the U.S. Constitution and the founding documents and Declaration of Independence. I mean, they aspired to great things, but they were innovative. In fact, they're creating the first republic in thousands of years. That's something to be said. Of course, we look at the principles of the founding, and we say we are guided by the universal principles that are established there, right? That people want, that free people want to exercise that freedom, that we're born in freedom, we're not born in captivity, that we have a conscience, that we have this free will, right? And that ultimately all, like I said at the beginning of this conversation, that all arrangements of a government are set up in order to protect life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, or protect property. And they're interchangeable. In other words, because they've always, even the founders associated property to happiness. How much that you can accumulate your wealth and protect it and pass it on. So that's really what it comes down to. Of course, the founding had the founders had some issues that they had to compromise on, right? Slavery, issues of essentially of monetary policy, because they were dealing with what they could work with at the time, right? They didn't, the gold is they had established a gold standard, but then eventually it was undermined and almost immediately went to a central banking, right? Within its first 20 years, if not sooner, and then and so forth. And now we have pure paper fiat money, which is not a stable form for the development of wealth. So does the United States even currently today reflect the principles and ideals of the founding fathers? In some places it still tries to, but in others it certainly has fallen short.
Yeah, I tend to agree. We certainly have strayed quite far away, I think, in many ways, from those founding ideals. You mentioned banking system at the very outset of the Republic. I just finished reading all the collected writings of Alexander Hamilton, and you see and someone to whom I would assume you're very hostile, because from the very outset, it was his purpose, his motivating purpose to establish the National Bank of America, and he did by compromise. But I love the fact that you highlight that there was so much compromise, and we like to look back and imagine it was an age of absolute ideological purity. But from the very beginning, you couldn't just pursue that which seemed pristine from an ideological point of view, right? There was so much that had to be debated and like you said, compromised to, in order to create what we have today. So speaking of what we have today, I want to get into a few of the topics. All right, so I'm glad you indulged me for a little while to talk more abstractly, to talk a little bit more philosophically, but now we'll get into some of the things with which we're contending right now and today. Now, I just recently visited your Twitter page, and you made it a startling announcement about what you plan to do in regards to Governor DeSantis's latest either antic or stunt or political maneuver, whatever you call it, whatever in whatever terms you might frame it, to send illegal aliens or illegal immigrants, however you call them, up to Martha's Vineyard. So maybe you can talk about that announcement a little bit.
Sure. It's sad to see that we've had a governor who his sole mission for at least the last 2 years at this point has been to accumulate power at the expense of Floridians. That has not only through the suffering through the pandemic and the lockdowns, but being one of the first governors who locked down any of their states, and one of the last ones to essentially end their state of emergency. I mean, we basically were the emergency was lifted about a week and a half before California formally reopened. And even today, we still have mandates in terms of mask mandates that were argued in schools, or vaccine mandates that are argued or that are required in public health hospitals. So there is a question, and today now that we're in a recession, that there's a question of what has our government done about it, especially our state government. And why do I say that is because when we talk about inflation, we just see some people like talk about this in terms of raising of prices. And I'll get back to my announcement in a moment. We've seen a raise of prices in all sorts of areas in terms of our housing, electricity or gasoline, and food, right? Certainly if you go to a grocery store, you are paying a lot more. You're looking for ways to economize. So we are, and frankly, a lot of that we have impacts from the state policies that could be remedied, but we have simply an absentee governor who has simply launched himself into a national campaign early for president, and that has essentially cost Floridians their quality of life and allowed the cost of living to increase without any reaction from state government. So what I mean specifically, you have one of the biggest issues these days has been property insurance. Property insurance that goes up. So there's been basically, because of the increased cost of housing, the insurance companies are having to essentially guarantee homes that now cost more, and they're just exiting the market. Now, the private sector is exiting the market as quickly as it can, and even the public option of citizens insurance is dropping policies that can no longer afford to underwrite. So that leaves ever fewer options and more expensive options out in the marketplace. So someone who would be paying $2,000, a year would now suddenly be paying $8,000 a year. And if you were in a relatively short, fixed income on a salary, particularly, you are going to feel that very severely. And a lot of people are feeling the pressure whether they can keep their home or not. And some people haven't. So then you have obviously property taxes overall are essentially aligned to the value of the properties. Whether obviously it's a regressive and awful tax, a property tax. I would eliminate it as tomorrow if I could, and certainly as governor I would. And again, these are the problems that continue to arise. Florida again has no comprehensive energy policy. It allows basically monopolies to dictate everything, and unfortunately that has led to the electric companies, the electric utilities, these monopolies made a big bet on natural gas. And when the Biden administration came in, the price of gas, the natural gas was that fuels the power plants. That gas is natural gas basically went up in cost, and obviously the bills went up for everybody, anywhere from 200 to 400% in months. So somebody in Key West would be paying $200, and all of a sudden they're paying $800. I've seen it too in my electricity bill, and even though it's not as severe, it's still doubled easily from a year or two ago. So the latest publicity stunt. So we have, if you haven't heard about it, the details are just simply as follows. The governor had taken a state policy to transport what they called unauthorized aliens, to give them to pay for tickets for them to leave the state of Florida, or some kind of transportation. It's just open, right? Just whatever form of transportation they're welcome to take, so they can go anywhere but staying in Florida, obviously voluntarily. So he used this program to basically send a contractor over to Texas. He couldn't find any takers in Florida, basically. Went to Texas, and this contractor, as the accounts explain, were lured with the promises of housing, with jobs. They were given food and clothing and cell phones and other resources, and put on and they collected 50 people on 2 planes. That means 25 passenger private planes now. They spent up to $12,000 per person, and they flew them from Texas, wherever they were in Texas, and landed him in the middle of the night in Martha's Vineyard in Massachusetts, a very well-to-do community. And that was somewhat, basically to make a political point that this is what it looks like when immigrants land on your front lawn. So you should have some you can have some compassion or understanding what the border states are dealing with. Now, Ron DeSantis is the governor of Florida for now, at least, right? He was not authorized under that state law to have establish a program to take people in Texas, an entirely another state, and then move them to another state. Right. The only authorization was take them from Florida and move them out. Right. Even the governor of Texas and their government didn't know anything about what he was doing. So it wasn't like, oh, you do this for us and it's a favor, right? We're coordinating, right? You're doing this under our jurisdiction. So at the end of the day, what my announcement is that I'm bringing a lawsuit to the Florida Supreme Court, demanding that Mr. DeSantis explain himself. Under what authority does he have to continue this program, which he has sworn to continue to do? And under the Florida Constitution, I have the standing to bring this lawsuit, and the Supreme Court usually will look at this case as a matter of public importance. That millions of dollars are being allocated, and precious time and resources are being misspent by the governor to focus on an issue that doesn't directly impact Floridians. So there, and his hope, I mean, he explained it in a conference in a conference yesterday, a press conference, that that allegedly he's only targeting people who say they want to eventually go to Florida. Like that's going to make a difference. Like, but before they come here, we're going to go get them, right? Something averse to or close to like pre-crime. The point is that the flights are chartered in another state. The state didn't authorize a program to do that, and yet on top of that, they're purposely setting flight paths to take these planes back through Florida, refueling them there. By the way, they're smaller planes, so to get from Texas to like a Massachusetts over 2,000 miles, you need to refuel at least 2 times, and they did that. So they would stop in Florida, which again is exactly not the point of the law, which says take them out of Florida, not bring them in. And then goes and delivers them, for this publicity stunt, and immediately takes credit for it when people are asking, well, who's responsible for this, right? Proudly, because this is the point he's trying to make. Now, I firmly believe in limited government. This is not a limited government governor, even though he claims to, he says he's a conservative Republican that has served in the military and has sworn to uphold the Constitution several times in his different capacities as either a member of Congress, a member of the military, or as a governor. So we're down to the Supreme Court can take this question, oblige the governor to respond, and then decide whether the governor exceeded his authority or not, and simply order him to stop. But the point is, at this point is like after 2 years of him actually acting under emergency authorities, there's really been nothing to actually limit his behavior. So he's just continued to live off of publicity stunts, which of course Floridians have to continue to pay for in a time when many are wondering about their financial futures. I think it's unfair, and I think the lawsuit will provide some needed pushback to the governor, and certainly some pause. And I think the question of him using these kind of funds ultimately in the middle of an election should be rejected. I mean, frankly, my ideal is that I already told you earlier that he's obviously using immigrants who are fleeing from very, very bad situations to seek asylum in the United States, and he's essentially abused these people, many who don't speak English, for a publicity stunt. It's inhumane, honestly, and I'd originally called for his resignation.
Yeah, this is an issue on which about which I'm a little bit uncertain. Certainly one with which I'm uncomfortable. seems to me in every way morally disagreeable to use fellow human beings as means more than ends. It speaks to a deeper moral issue, I think. Like I follow Immanuel Kant in this regard. Like you need to have a humane maxim, and that's never to use another human being as a mean, right? You should always be considered as an end. Politically, I think, though this is terrible to say, it might be a masterful stroke if it makes some of these sanctuary cities and towns recognize some of the difficulty that that sort of agenda, that sort of an idea imposes upon others. Now, I'm not saying I agree with it, but I think your explication of exactly what's happening is needed right now, because it really shed a lot of light on how exactly this came to be, and whether or not this was really in the best interest of Floridians, or whether it was really just intended to advance the prestige of a politician who might be seeking higher office on a national stage. You mentioned one thing that I wanted to address, and I lost it right now because there was a lot in that answer. I want to go back very, very briefly. You spoke about Florida's approach to the pandemic. Now, I think your explanation of how we responded, or how the state government responded to it, is somewhat dissonant to that which we heard across the media. Now, of course, we know that there's a certain bias in the media, but I think a lot of listeners would hear your explanation of what happened during the pandemic and feel somewhat surprised. So maybe just very briefly, maybe you can comment on the fact that generally Florida was held as this either a bastion of freedom or a sort of a hellscape of libertinism, where there were no rules, and masks were dismissed immediately, and people were just debauched and in the bars and all sorts of things in the summer of 2020.
And don't forget, they're going to kill a lot of grandmas.
Of course, this is where grandma goes to die in more ways than one. I mean, they do call it the doorstep to the graveyard, but jokingly, and that was prior to the pandemic. So maybe you can just comment on that a little bit more. You don't have to go into any great depth, but how do you think the media misunderstood exactly how maybe authoritarian Florida was in its approach to the pandemic?
Sure. Well, so the direct answer really is that the media knows exactly what they're doing. They coordinate. We've seen them coordinate for the last couple of years, particularly as it dealt with Donald Trump, where they pushed a narrative that was absolutely false about Russian interference in the 2016 election, or at least the participation of Mr. Trump in the a supposed Russian conspiracy to change the outcome of the 2016 election. Now, the aftermath of that, we've seen them just simply browbeat and drumbeat this call to what ended up happening was a two-time impeachment, right? So and of course with the events that led up after that, the reality is that the media picks winners and losers. They do. They pick one and they ascend their star into the heavens through all the support, with all the impression and support that they can give them with just airtime, right? They did it for Donald Trump, thinking, and literally it's been determined by WikiLeaks, with the WikiLeaks drop, that the Hillary Clinton campaign, the DNC, conspired with major media figures to elevate Donald Trump because they felt that they would have the best chance of electing Hillary through him, right? And lo and behold, they were all surprised to lose, right? To just prove how odious their tactics and their candidate was to most Americans, or at least enough Americans. And in this case, there's no different. The media has chosen to ascend Ron DeSantis' star, are trying to weigh the balance and make him the rising star in a conservative movement. And for the most part, his policies have not differed any really from most Democrats. And so you're not going to have a lot of opposition from Democrats either. It's very quiet on that side. There in Florida, in fact, there's no opposition party because they simply agree with the policies of Florida. Florida has become the one of the most pro-gun control states, or the most pro-gun control state, pardon me, that is led by Republicans. They've also pro-tax and all these things that end up being this issue. But back to DeSantis, is the media's treatment is that he can do no wrong, and even to the point that they're trying to change history and say and stop him and refuse to and continue to repeat this idea after that DeSantis actually never even locked down Florida, which is not true whatsoever. And as I explained before, he had declared an emergency in the state of Florida over the COVID pandemic for 475 days. And it still felt even through this year. Now, what exactly happened is that, yes, there was a lockdown. He was one of the first governors to lock down in their state. He kept the state closed 100% for 30 days. The first actual state that opened up was Georgia. And what subsequently happened after that, was even with that, DeSantis ordered state troopers on the border to Georgia to prevent people from coming. He says, quote, tongue in cheek, to prevent New Yorkers from coming into Florida, but basically it was everybody. And then, but generally, eventually there was a scheduled reopening. It was different phases, but the phase wasn't simply on a timeline. It was also geographic. So what ended up happening is that eventually you had phases of reopening, but the big cities really weren't affected. So most population of Florida actually had to deal with some type of continued lockdown, curfews, or restrictions on daily living, even though the many other parts of Florida acted like they had none whatsoever. And that's important to note because it's a political decision that was made. And so who the Democrats are going to dispute that or argue against that and make noise about it because they approve, right? They would want that emergency to have gone as long as possible. And the motivation obviously was political. DeSantis, the long story of DeSantis is that he was a nobody congressman from Northeast Florida. He made his claim to fame as being as serving as some type of JAG embedded officer in Iraq with a forward unit, and then served time in Guantanamo. In basically working with prisoners in their torture camp that they have there. So yeah, that's all he was known for. Basically, a neoconservative, someone who would support whatever was told to him by the military-industrial complex, and for the foreign policy war hawks, in other words. Now fast forward a little bit. Donald Trump comes in, he's tapped by whoever, and his name is whispered into ear Donald Trump. Donald Trump endorses him in a Republican primary while he's a sitting president for governor of Florida. He wins by a landslide that primary and ekes out a victory against a younger Democrat candidate, Andrew Gillum. The difference being about 38,000 votes. So we fast forward to now is that Ron DeSantis wasn't any popular. See, can you not hear me?
I can now. Yeah,
Okay.
you cut out just momentarily. Yeah.
So, just to repeat, so the DeSantis, by prolonging the emergency, he could continue to receive essentially unlimited dollars from the bailouts from Washington, and he, under the emergency structure, he was the sole authority to disperse those funds and establish a statewide system of graft or political patronage, right? So all over the place. So he made his friends very, very wealthy, and was able to use that as the base to establish a political machine that he did not have whatsoever before that. Now, understand then the media basically adopted him as well and elevated his profile, saying that, oh, he's resisting, he's anti-science, he's resisting this or that. I mean, and to a certain effect, it's half true, right? He resisted further lockdowns. He resisted the way that the CDC was broadcasting on mask mandates, for instance. But the argument that DeSantis was bringing wasn't that the lockdowns were bad. He said that the science that the CDC was bringing was bad, and so he couldn't continue he couldn't continue to justify the lockdown. But he did support the idea of lockdown, just not for that reason. So this is not someone who obviously who's not a libertarian, but actually that's important to note too, because the media has actually tried to trumpet DeSantis as some type of libertarian messiah figure, which couldn't be further from the truth, especially considering everything I've just been discussing. Now, I mean, after the 475 days was about June of last year. What happens after that is the school districts continue to have their mandates on masking. They're continuing to push for voluntary vaccinations, which you couldn't tell the difference between the voluntary vaccination program and the mandatory vaccination program. And many people, got the vaccine, and you were still obligated, and even to now, to take the vax if you want access to certain healthcare. Now, in the middle of all that, you have a riot from parents in red counties, and not even red counties, actually pretty much everywhere, demanding to unmask the kids at these school boards. There was a statewide campaign that to basically unseat school board members where they could, and a lot of them won election this previous August, but not before last November. The Department of Justice, Biden's Department of Justice, released a memo calling all these angry parents all over Florida as domestic terrorists. And you know what? DeSantis didn't really say anything. So why? Because we're dealing with again, when it comes back to the question about the differences between political parties, you're dealing with a group that basically does conspire together to maintain power, and they receive money from the same sources for the most part. And sometimes they're hedge funds in New York. Sometimes they're conservative billionaires out of Nevada or some other place in Florida. I mean, the reality is that the decisions that the elections themselves are not end up deciding anything. It's really this who can capture the hearts and minds or the culture of the moment, right, to justify or to receive support for their political policy. It takes a lot of effort to disrupt that, because once people feel like this is justifiable, then it's very difficult to go back. And I will, the famous underpinning to this kind of thought is that, don't forget, Hitler was elected to power in that same way, and subsequently so. So this is and that it's not a direct inference of DeSantis as Hitler. I'm just saying he does act like a king, but he hasn't killed as many people. Right? Yeah. So that's what it comes down to.
Yeah, far fewer. I will caution you, always be careful with the argumentum ad Hitlerum. Anytime Hitler is introduced into the argument, you know the rest.
Right. Just to say that political processes produce a lot of creatures of a lot of despots.
Yes, and I think we would all agree with that. You mentioned President Trump, former President Trump, in your last comment. Now, of course, as we all know, I think permanently now, he is a fellow resident of the state of Florida, of which you would like to be governor. So my question to you is, in your attempt to gain his suffrage, to get his vote, how would you reach out to a voter like him, like President Trump?
Well, the people, listen, there's much division in the Democrat Party as there are in the Republican Party, but the agreement between the parties is really in their leadership. So at the grassroots level, at the average member of the Republican Party, for instance, there is a division about whether they should support Donald Trump for another term and put him back in the White House to just give it back to the establishment, versus, oh, we want a younger, better talking, better looking, younger Trump figure in DeSantis. So they do have that difference. I'll point out right now that as far as I understand, President or former President Donald Trump has not endorsed Florida Governor Ron DeSantis for re-election. Just to point that out.
So the endorsement is open from the former president.
Technically, I suppose that'd be true. I wouldn't accept it, in considering.
So you could see where you could see where I'm going with this. We perhaps can get an announcement on Truth Social, advocating and endorsing everyone to go out and vote for Roos this November. But you wouldn't accept that endorsement. You would reject it.
I would not accept it. I would not publicly accept it. I don't have to reject it if I don't accept it. So it's just one of those things that people know what's going on, and that people have caught wind that there is, really what happened was last year, when people were talking about, people were really putting pressure on Ron DeSantis to not run, or to openly commit to not running for president. Clearly, at this point, a few months before the election, he went full blast all summer long. He's been traveling the entire state, the entire country, and the state for that matter, campaigning nationally, endorsing in other states, making speeches. He's clearly running a national campaign.
So you think it's a fait accompli? You think it's inevitable that he will run in 2024?
Even if he loses, he's going to run. That's how committed he is to the process, and he's built himself a team and a fundraising structure that he did not have before. He would be foolish to not run. In fact, I mean, if Beto O'Rourke can run multiple times for president and for governor of Texas, or statewide office in Texas without,
and for Senate, and for Senate as well.
Yes, that's a statewide office, right? So if he can continue to do that, because he has a fundraising base, why can't Ron DeSantis be the Beto O'Rourke of the Republican Party?
Yeah, I suppose he possibly could be, although he has a more, I would say, auspicious future ahead of him than our dearly beloved Beto. But no, that's an interesting comparison that you draw, linking the two. So I would ask you, do you think that, not to focus on Donald Trump for too long, but so do you think his political future remains fruitful, or do you think he's overripe? Do you think his time has passed?
Well, let's just say you can't do any worse than Joe Biden.
But yeah,
even some Democrats will agree at this point.
Yeah, I think the more candid of that bunch would agree. Tell me, between the two parties, because it seems as though you feel as though there is some sort of conspiratorial action going on between the two, and to a certain extent, I tend to agree. Which do you think is more eager to protect liberty, the Republican Party or the Democratic Party?
Neither. I mean, it's very obvious. They conspired to lock down the country. They conspired to develop, what we're now calling is these dangerous diseases overseas that then contaminate the world. Right. That's really the arguments that they've been making, and there's no one held accountable. Why is that? Because they're in on it.
Yeah. I understand what you're saying.
In other words, they're responsible for the policies, and they're responsible for the cover-up, so that no one is held accountable. In the same way that they're all guilty of having worked with Jeffrey Epstein, but none of them are going to jail either.
Mm-hmm. Yes. So this brings me to again, maybe a more general idea, and that's the idea of liberty. You say that neither of the two parties, neither the Democratic nor the Republican, is particularly interested in protecting and enhancing liberties. What do you say to a population, to a country founded upon the ideal of liberty that seems to have that spark, that flame, seems to have seen that spark or flame extinguished in some way? This is one of the things on which I was reflecting during the course of the pandemic and for the years after it, or at least the year after it. I thought about the quote from Patrick Henry, the famous quote that he with which he ended his speech at St. John's Church in Richmond, Virginia, and he said famously, "Give me liberty, or give me death." Right? We all, especially libertarians, we all relish that quote because it speaks to something sort of inborn in the American spirit. But I fear that today, his quote, his immortal quote, would be inverted to read something like, "Give me security, give me an assurance that I don't have to think about the possibility of death, of my own mortality, and I'll resign all of my liberty. I'll relinquish it straight away." Now, I know this isn't exactly an agenda item on which you're running. It's more of it's a broader idea, it's a broader thought, but it's one with which I've been contending for the past year or two. So maybe you can speak to that idea. And again, just to narrow it a little bit, it's the idea that as a people, as an American people, that flame of liberty that we all thought was deeply embedded in our souls and was inextinguishable might be flickering a little bit and might be going out. What do you say to that?
Sure. These days, it sounds like for most people, just who are distracted with TV, the live streaming programs, or simply are under too much stress from debt and bills and the problems of life to really care about the government around them. It's no wonder that half of all voting age adults in Florida aren't even registered to vote. And half of them are expected. Half of the rest of them are expected to. Only half of them are expected to come out and actually vote in this election. It's easy to lose hope because of the inertia of it. The very culture you look at, you wonder, is this it, right? And so I wanted to. I beg to counter. What my campaign is about is actually is reaching out to the people who do still care, right? Government, at the end of the day, is no matter what, it is we always have a government by the consent of the governed, and consent withdrawn by even a small number of people, 5 to 15%, is more than sufficient to essentially disable any government policy anywhere. So I think people forget that they highlight too much responsibility on the democratic model or simply elections to change things, when really it's always been a smaller group of people who who are simply motivated enough to actively display their disagreement or even their disobedience to a policy. Obviously the lockdowns ended sooner or later, and they were sooner because people just refused. At such a point, when you make such huge claims the way that government did over 2 years, you recognize that they put their reputation on the line, that the scientists knew what they were doing, that the politicians could be trusted, that the key understandings that gird any political decision of that magnitude. At some point, when it isn't as serious as they made it out to be, confidence in their leadership is going to be undermined. People are going to become radicalized to the idea that why are we even dealing with this kind of political class and this political structure that is unaccountable, that is inflexible, and that only serves its own interests. So my campaign is really about providing people a contrast and an option where they can simply express their disapproval of both parties. I'm the only candidate that's on the ballot that represents a political party that is not a Democrat or a Republican, after all. And the fact of the matter is, those who are awake and looking for solutions and answers to what is happening can find a home in the Libertarian Party. and find a home with people who, like them, disagree with the policies and dicta of the two parties and their leadership and their special interests. And we can see that and society, all political change at the end of the day is simply the effect of a change in culture that causes the actual change. So that is, which is again something that's simply reflected by people who care enough to make it to motivate the rest of society to take action.
Yes, and I think in many instances, people fail to recognize that there is a third way, that there could be an alternative to what has become a thoroughly frustrating and in many ways decrepit institution that is our national politics and state politics as well. So thank you for that answer. I think that was very well said. I want to touch on a few more specific topics. The first being the issue of abortion.
Sure.
So I'll ask you, if as governor a bill were brought before your desk restricting abortion to the first 6 weeks of gestation, would you veto or sign it?
I do not see a bill like that coming up in Florida, where we have one that's being disputed in the courts for a 15-week ban.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I chose one that was more restrictive, reflective of what is being proposed.
Understood.
In Texas.
I would not sign that. If it came down to it, I would make it an effort to make sure a bill like that wouldn't even reach my desk. But if necessary, I would veto it.
Now,
there's two reasons why. One is that to enforce these bans, one would need to, like any prohibition, one would need to set up a police state in order around it. The idea, and actually, in this case, not simply a police state, but a surveillance state to monitor whether someone actually is pregnant, in order to enforce the law, and then you would need a police state to enforce it. So what happens in other states right now in the current climate after the Roe versus Wade reversal, the U.S. Supreme Court, is that you have law enforcement agencies that are monitoring social media posts and using them to create a probable cause to then investigate whether someone got an abortion or is trying to seek one, and then prosecute them. So this has not happened in Florida, but it has happened in like Alabama, right? So and this type of tyranny is, let's see, in order, the reason is that you have to basically do the harm test. Does this do more harm than good? And it's very basic, and that's a very conservative approach, right? So we're talking about issues that fundamentally transform the relationship between government and the governed. So who's in charge, right? In Florida, the government has made arrangements to establish legal precedent to force women to have to carry pregnancies to term. Now, I have to say this: I'm personally pro-life. I know people. I'm personally pro-life. I think life is sacred. I understand that people don't have the same opinion as me, and I want everybody to understand that 70%, if not more than 70%, of all abortions are elective. They are committed. Actually, more than that, but the 70% are committed only because of financial stress. People feel they cannot simply afford to carry the baby to the pregnancy of the baby to term. And that's sad. But the reality is that before the recent decision over the summer to reverse Roe versus Wade by the U.S. Supreme Court, abortions were at an all-time low. And why? Because people were choosing either to not be pregnant. They were choosing to in other ways, right, that didn't deal with abortion. They were like celibacy, or they're practicing with other whatever safe sex mods.
Or social isolation as a consequence of the COVID lockdowns.
Certainly, and actually, I would more say that there simply is a lot more younger people who are living socially isolated to begin with. Like, in other words, because of the internet, because of lifestyle choices, they simply have been not had more physical interaction with people. They've just had less of it.
So perhaps that that social isolation, I agree. I think that pre-exists the pandemic, but I think
Of course.
perhaps it was exacerbated by the pandemic. Yes, yeah, absolutely.
I also want to say one other thing is that you do understand, and I've said this in other interviews, that the times have changed. People also do not look down on teen pregnancy anymore. It's not a you're not made a social pariah. It's not a look at this person, right? So it's become more social accepted, is what I'm saying. Social norms have changed in that regards, and that's also one of the other types of reasons why people would seek an abortion. Now, and this being that there's so much more public funding of abortions than ever before, you think that people would be having them like eating Tic Tacs, but they haven't, right? But again, the prohibition that states are seeking now is drawing new battle lines and encouraging people to simply rebel and have more of them. So it's on the uptick again. And that's really the consequence of or the moral hazard of public policy in that sense. So I answered the question. I went through the abortion issue. There is no consensus, clear consensus in the Libertarian Party in regards to. I would mention that within as a party itself in regards to abortion. Why? Because some people do take it very seriously that it is that life is sacred, and they will, to the extent that if government does want to prove that it's defense of life, right? Life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, this is an area that government should be involved, and they make that as an isolated choice, not as a general broad brushstroke, right? So I simply disagree that is necessarily the case, because ultimately, you still have to, to what extent do you use force to oblige someone else to not end life, right? You basically, to what extent? Violence is essentially the power to take their lives at the end of the day, or to hold them against their will, and otherwise violate the meaning that we have this life for, right? Free will. So, and of course, at the end of the day, do I really want to, use my tax dollars to want my tax dollars to go towards the initiation of violence? No.
Yeah, and wonderfully said. And you anticipated my next question, which was to know the libertarian defense, let's say, of the unborn child. I think in the libertarian circle, it's sort of a fraught issue. It's a fraught debate, because it really can be argued from the the bodily autonomy of the woman who's in her gestational phase, and that of the unborn child, who is, some would claim, just as deserving of life, liberty, and, well, the pursuit of happiness. And that pursuit of happiness is certainly stifled before it can get underway if certain procedures are adopted. So, no, thank you for your candor regarding that issue, because I know it can be sensitive, and I'm sure you've been asked it before. So it's a well considered opinion, for which I thank you.
Right. I would basically help anybody who I could that was in a unplanned pregnancy carry the child to term, the baby to term.
Mm-hmm.
But that's a decision of mine, right? Not
Right.
a decision that I want to compel others to make. And frankly, my running mate, the lieutenant governor running mate, Tub Rodenbaugh, he would say that the government has to, or the church, or people who are religious, because oftentimes it's tied to religious belief. That people of faith, particularly Christians, as he's a Christian pastor, have to stop using the state to compel them to be good Christians, right? To get away from that model, and it's still something that's debated. So that's why there's no single platform position on abortion in the Libertarian Party.
Yeah, and perhaps
although some state affiliates are welcome to have their own, from what I understand.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But Florida doesn't have one either.
Yeah. Perhaps it's healthier for a party to approach something that way. Maybe not, but I like the idea of an ongoing debate, of an open question that needs resolution at some point. But I think once you become ideologically captured, as to some extent both parties have been, both traditional parties, you lose that the essence of the question, and you just become stuck, and you're no longer weighing new evidence. You're no longer reading more philosophical works to learn, okay, what was the proposition of John Locke? How might he approach this idea? Or how might David Hume, any philosopher? You become, I think, too ossified in one opinion. So I think that's well put. And I think also your fear of an enlargement of the police power is also one of which we should be acutely aware. And you speak to that I would say very providently. The idea that in order to police or to ensure that women and medical providers are adhering to these prohibitions, that necessarily will require an enlargement of a police force. And I think at the essence of libertarianism in some ways is an aversion to such an enlargement, to such an expansion of centralized police force and the surveillance state, in which unfortunately we are all living, be it in Florida or America writ large, as is evidenced by FBI raids and certain state actions, whether it be here or across the nation. I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, it may serve as a good demonstration or explanation that the stories behind the two different cases that I mentioned. One is the lawsuit against the 15-day abortion ban in Florida. It's currently stayed pending more court proceedings. But that case was brought forward by a Jewish woman with the approval of her rabbi, because in the Jewish faith they believe that if there's a problem with the pregnancy, they should terminate it, right? In other words, they are much more aware and vigilant regarding to let's just say developmental or abnormalities than other religions, and that as in other words, the ban actually prevents them from expressing the entire faith. That it's oppressive on them. Of course, with our science now, there's still things that could happen that they're detected before the 13-month and afterwards, right? That would still have to be weighted. They also argued that the 15 weeks is too soon to put the ban. It's too late to put the ban, for that matter. And the other case I mentioned was regarding the forcing of a woman to actually maintain their pregnancy during the term, which was a woman who's 16 years old. She is a ward of the state. That means she has a caseworker. She lives in the foster care system, and she has a guardian ad litem. And they decide, and she ran away. She obviously had some mental disturbance, and she got pregnant, and she wanted to have an abortion. And they decided to take it to court to have a panel decide whether she could or not. Now, of course, the reality is that you couldn't have the abortion without at that age without a guardian to approve it. So that basically meant that they didn't want to do it, and they want to take it. They didn't want to simply decline it. They wanted to actually make a legal case out of it and have a 3-panel judge decide for her. They went all the way up to appeals court to basically set a precedent that if the state does have the right to tell someone that they cannot have, they must maintain the pregnancy during the term. So that's really what we're living in Florida. I think during COVID, I'll close out with this topic with COVID. People who declined to go on a respirator, who declined to go on experimental drugs to treat or experimental regimens to treat the onset of COVID respiratory illness. There was one extreme case of a teacher in West Palm Beach County whose doctor wanted to try out other drugs that had better effects, that had been demonstrated to have better effects, that were not as toxic. And the hospital would not release this woman into the care of her physician, and would not even let her go on her own recognizance and release her to her family. They basically kept her trapped there, and while she refused treatment, they had to take it to court. But they eventually won, but she passed away before she could get treatment. that she had wanted with the consultation of her doctor. So this idea of bodily autonomy actually more or less looks like that, being forced into or obligated or having your decision of your health be made by somebody against your will. And that, it's an entire school of thought that it's relative. It's important simply because we have, we deal with we've dealt with it in the last 2 years. I myself have had family members who have passed away from what I think were, obviously heart conditions regarding circulatory issues related to them having taken experimentally or emergency authorized vaccination protocols. And that's really where we're at, right? That's really where we're at. So, yeah, we do have to. I think we have to resist. I think the moment now is to resist these questions about forced medical procedures done to you or obliged to you with no other options, and certainly more that you need to have more opportunities and more opinions, frankly, being allowed is something that we need to fight for. I think this is the moment now to draw that line. That's the hill to die on.
Yeah, I tend to agree with you. My fear is that we've kind of, as a people, kind of sunk into this supine spinelessness and no longer have that vigor and fight. I hope that we are able to restore it. I think that a candidacy like yours is actually beneficial in that regard. I think that hearing these ideas of liberty, of autonomy, of rights, of freedom, inspire people, especially after a long duration of oppression and dictates and mandates and interdictions on what you could or could not do, where you could or could not go, with whom you could spend an afternoon, and where you could do it. So I think the libertarianism and the agenda on which you're running has a refreshing quality to it. I think for that reason, it will only increase in popularity, and I see you being at the head of that, at the head of that kind of vanguard movement.
Well, I appreciate the sentiment. Let me share something. We've come a long way from even when our parents' generations came from, when they thought things like abortion were supposed to be, rare and emergencies, right? To the point where Florida passed a 15-day ban on abortions with no exceptions to rape or incest. Now, a woman being raped, they're going to oblige a woman being raped to carry the baby of their attacker. I mean, that doesn't make sense to me, But other people want to oblige it because of their religious belief. I still think that's imposition of someone else's religious belief on that person, on another person. So this is, and it's all masqueraded at the end of the day anyway. It's all masquerade because at the end of the day, it's whatever justification to increase a politician's power and authority, to make the position more powerful, and without actually having to accomplish any meritorious policy changes. Look at that, right? Without being rewarded for political courage or to tackle an issue that had been actually that's disrupting the lives of Floridians or anybody really. But that's literally where we're at. They're using these kind of these debates, which are really endless, right? To constantly distract the people from what's important, which is their lives, really, their lives, their everyday lives, their function. People cannot take for granted, that gas will always be plentiful and readily available, that food will remain inexpensive, the housing is that they'll be able to access housing for themselves and a growing family, or they can even afford to have a family for that matter. You can never hope to have one. So I mean, people know that these things have been taken for granted, and now they're looking back and saying, what do I do about it? And libertarians have answers to these things. The Republicans and Democrats are really going to just continue to sell people a story about how it's somebody else's fault, and that we need to draw out these debates for more years. 40. I mean, they ended Roe versus Wade, the decision. They reversed it 50 years after the fact. I mean, if you pull out something that that people's lives that will be, or lives and legal structures, all sorts of legal structures will develop around. It's going to be disruptive to create more political disruption, more controversy, and more conflict between people, not between people and politicians, but just between people.
Right, and of course, that is something that the court takes into consideration anytime ruling on a difficult issue with some long-standing. Right, it's the idea that society has so embraced this decision that it now becomes so entangled in our lives that it would be severely detrimental to unravel it, unless, in the case of Roe and Casey, it is so overtly unconstitutional, which by any good legal reasoning it does seem to be, or seems to have been. But I'm no constitutional scholar. I'm speaking completely.
It could be argued. It could always be argued in either way, and for the same reasons that it could be argued, the value of life, right? The prominence of the role of government in life, although some of it may have an underpinning in religion. The question though was, you already have 50 years later, and was it worth it? Was it worth it to basically disrupt the entire legal landscape and cause conflict among people at a time when abortions were in decline? I don't think it was a good idea.
That then you would have to put forth, and we don't have to get into this too deeply, but given that reasoning, you would have to say that a case like Dred Scott versus Sanford should not have been reversed, because that also had long-standing, probably about a half century's time, was part of the American fabric at that age, unfortunately, but it was overturned in Brown. So I get what you're saying, I do, but I think that the constitutionality has to take precedence over the temporality, over the amount of time that it is in existence in a society.
And that is a great argument, because I think the one argument that you're saying is the number one reason why I went, I wouldn't have done it, but I'm glad it did, because it still provides us a mechanism to decentralize these conversations. However, I know how to be used politically.
Yes, and and you're looking at it from both ends, which is exactly the way you should. The first response, the impulse that I had was beyond the morality or the immorality of abortion. I looked at it as a constitutional matter, and it seemed to me proper to return this issue to the states, just based on its absence, its lack. It goes unmentioned, it's unstated in the Constitution, right? So from the perspective of liberty, you would think, yes, decentralize that issue, federalize it, bring it back to the states. But then the secondary impact is the one that you explained, is, okay, well then the enlargement of the police power, right? The intrusion into people's lives, that is a repercussion of now what the states will do, and they will enact their own laws. And after enactment is enforcement.
You can consider my concern that a lot of people simply bent over backwards to appease political leaders, to lock themselves in their homes, to essentially destitute themselves because they don't work in an essential job, and to allow this expansion of power without check, right? And then all of a sudden you're going to give those same people more power through that court decision. I mean, that's really where it comes down to. In a sense, I'm concerned about the social fabric of America as well. Just another thing to divide people. When it was federalized, and I mean federalized, meaning that it was something that was one standard for the entire country. At least the country itself could experience one standard to argue against. But now we have 50 standards. So and really like the Second Amendment issues, right? You have to know what those rules are in every state that you go into. So that's really what it's going to end up coming down to. That you have to be very wary of where you are and where you're going at any time, because there's some states that prohibit transport, for instance, of unregistered firearms between states, or registered firearms. You have to get a license even to move it between one state and another if you're going through car or truck or bus. I mean, so that's the analogy, or a similar comparison for what ends up happening.
Yeah, I think that's part of the confused beauty of the federalist system. All right, you have this limited core of government, hopefully a limited core of government. Of course, it's quite expanded its original small size, and then a lot of experiments in all the states, and Florida trying something that's quite different from that which Texas or Montana is attempting. So again, it's a confusion. It's a ball of confusion, but I think an elegant confusion ultimately. So I want to ask you one question maybe about education, and then, because you've been so generous with your time so far, maybe then we'll move on to a few rapid fire questions and then conclude. Is that agreeable to you?
Sure.
Excellent.
Let's do it.
So from a libertarian's perspective, what do you think is the state's role in education? I know that's a very broad question, but Florida has been at the center of a lot of people's attention when it comes to education, especially after the bill that was passed this last summer. So how does a libertarian approach the state's involvement in education?
Okay, so there's quite a number of things to say about here. First of all, let's start with the law. The Florida Constitution requires that the state of Florida provide an education for every child in the state. That does not mean necessarily one-size-fits-all curriculum-based education. There are many different modes of education and many ways of delivering the education. The one thing I will tell you is that nothing has been nothing has transformed education in this country and the state more than the lockdowns did, because it proved that the model of curriculum-based education that public schools have been relying on in Florida, that was based on basically an economy and a society of the 19th century, sorry. The 19th century is no longer, or maybe the mid 20th century, is really no longer necessary to have all this overhead and be so costly, right? So the idea that you had your kids sitting at home and parents saying, "Oh, look at all the subject matters they're listening to, how much they're getting done. Why do I need them to actually go back to a building and deal with the traffic and deal with the headaches and other children who are not necessarily well behaved, and in communities that are not necessarily safe, and to be educated by professionals that were hired not because they wanted to teach, but because they couldn't find another job. That's important. I mean, that's that. Of course, people are going to want to pull their kids out of it, and they've been doing it in record numbers. So either to homeschooling or some type of virtual schooling, or basically home. Or yes.
Do you champion that transition away from the public schools? Do you encourage that exodus that we've seen?
I think there's room for the exodus. I think people should not be limited to any particular choice. I think that I've worked in what they call the school choice movement since 2014, or a little bit before that. I'm aware of what the both the industry and the political movement has accomplished, but I also think that it's gotten away from its principal mission. The movement used to be called parental choice. It was not school choice; it was parental choice. So there's a big difference. School choice means that the government still allows you so many varying options of education that are legal, that we will recognize for you, while parental choice is literally whatever the parent wants for their child, not limited or burdened by the select list of regulated choices that are offered by policymakers who are influenced by a school choice industry.
And that is,
they don't want me to. They do not want me to say this, by the way.
Mm-hmm.
I'm certain of it.
Yeah, that's a distinction with a very important difference, though. And I was not aware of the fact that originally it was parental choice and has somehow evolved to become school choice.
To tell you the truth, the whole movement actually started in the late 80s by progressive Democrats in the Midwest. So why? Because they understand that the parents need to have the responsibility of. They actually understood it was progressive, right? See, the thing is that it's actually a anachronistic. The public school system, as it is, how it's modeled throughout the entire United States, is just anachronistic. There's nothing progressive about it.
Terribly, yeah. Well,
So
progressive perhaps in that it's reflective of the old German style, right? Of creating these very studious and efficient
Prussian, right.
Prussian style. I'm sorry, pre-German Prussian style. And of course, whenever we look for progressive ideas, we generally gaze toward the continent and toward Germany and toward France. So maybe in a way it was originally progressive.
Well, it's progressive to them because they didn't have any standardized education either. It was progressive. See, the thing is, the definition of progressive changes. All the definitions of these words tend to change to the context of and the history that they're founded. So progressive in the 1980s in Wisconsin was, we want to get where they have big factories, right? Big factory towns. And the ones that are still operating, not like the ones in Pennsylvania or New York, they basically looked at the system and said, we can do better, and parents should have a choice of different options. And so they decided, and not something dictated by politics, right? So the parents themselves could have more choices to provide for their children, certainly. And they're the ones who started this entire movement, where actually it ended up being championed by Democrats in Florida in the 90s. That's how this all started. But anyway, the history lesson aside, it's really always been about the parents, and it has been this. There's nothing shameful about to use the word progressive in the context of we want to change from anachronistic and dated methods and methodologies. If one can argue that the term conservative, as opposed, literally wants to conserve the past, by its actual wording. But and so people nowadays find themselves like, where do they really stand on these issues? And comfortably, I will tell you, the marriage of wanting to change break from the past and the tradition of the past, and seek toward choice and seek toward prosperity and wealth creation, is the Libertarian Party. They're the only ones that actually have a clear idea of how any of it works. I mean, so.
And hopefully in due time we'll see those ideas implemented. But I will say though that you read your Edmund Burke, the father of conservatism, and there is certainly in his thinking a desire to conserve that which came before, but also a willingness to adopt and to change and to progress in some ways. So I think that's worth noting as well. But you're right. It is important to understand these definitions, and I think your quick historical analysis of where school or parent choice and school choice came from is fascinating, and that's something that I did not know. And of course, I am a great supporter of school or parental choice in the modern age, and I think that parents are increasingly reasserting their claim, and I think that's a salutary thing. I think that's an excellent thing. And yes,
but there's two important distinctions to note. That the current movement in school choice has unfortunately been co-opted by this idea from establishment politics of co-parenting, that the actual ownership and the final decision maker over the choice, the actual educational options, actually is the state, and particularly politicians. So when I say that they want to limit the options that the parents can choose from, it's not because, again, it's really a consolidation of power issue, but really it's defined and circled by a parent. The government has a vested interest in the life of the child, and should have the final say, not the parents, in the future of those children, and that is obviously practically Maoist in its approach. So. And more fundamentally, I think it's communistic. The idea is that there's an impediment before complete inclusivity, right? At a certain point, if you're of that mind, of the communist mind or the Maoist mind, you want your highest loyalty, your deepest loyalty, to be to the state. So any smaller barrier between the individual and the state must be abolished. It must be raised. It must be taken down. So that's something that I see in regard to what you just said. The state having an interest, a growing interest in I don't know if I would call it the welfare of the state, but
but the body of I'm
Well,
sorry.
it's really that they really see children as future, as potential capital, right? And they do want to control capital markets. They want to regulate them, and nothing should be more regulated by them in their mind than labor, right? Which is why every aspect of this is really centered around markets and crony capitalism and planned centralized authorities. But with that said, I only have a few more minutes because I know my phone's batteries.
I know, and you've been so generous so far. So yeah, you can finish your thought. Maybe I'll throw one or two rapid fire questions at you.
Give me the questions. Let's do this.
You want to go right into them? Good.
Yeah.
All right. Now, because it is the 17th of September, Constitution Day, I have to ask you, which is more important to you, the Constitution or the Declaration of Independence?
Declaration of Independence.
I thought you might say that. Of all our founding fathers, to whom do you most look up?
Ooh. I got to think about that for a second. It's a mixture of. They were all so complicated people that it's hard to decide which one is the one. But I would say probably George Washington, the one that just gave away power, is probably the example that we all look forward to in terms of limited government, right?
Excellent. I was either anticipating Washington or Jefferson from you, or maybe Tom Paine. Next, the most influential book that you've read this year.
I've read several, and I'm wiping my face. What was this? I don't remember the name of these books. You know what? I honestly, I'll tell you some essays I was reading about from Hoppe, Hans Hermann Hoppe, about the I can't remember the name of it, but it was the idea that we have to have we have to have, if we're going to truly bring back sovereignty as a question or distributed authority, decentralization. At the end of the day, we're going to need market choices out there, and we need competition. Because we've had competition so long, and he's talking about this in the reference of like 1920s, right? Back when in the feudalistic society, that we can't even go back to that because we don't have any alternatives in the market to take on some of the services that government's providing now. So we need to reevaluate the whole mission and idea of decentralization as a result of that.
Excellent. And maybe you can send me a link to his work, to his essay, and I can include that in the show notes. And finally, perhaps most importantly, in the state of Florida, the state of which you very well might be the governor, what is your favorite Florida college football team?
I would say, sorry guys for UF, but FSU did beat Louisiana. So this year I'm rooting for FSU.
This year it's FSU, but in years prior it wasn't.
I'm in Miami, so it breaks my heart to see the destruction of the football team to the former president of the Clinton Foundation. But there you have it.
Perhaps they're in a state of restoration, though. I think they're in a state of rebuilding. You might not want to sever your allegiance.
That's 10 years.
Sever.
They just switched coaches again.
I know, but I'm told that this is a particularly auspicious coach. I think that things will turn around. I hope so for all our Miami fans.
Well, he's a homegrown guy, so
that's precisely right.
That usually means something.
Hopefully, and you're homegrown as well from Miami.
I've been raised in Miami. I've been here for over 30 years.
Excellent. So with that, Hector, I have to thank you for being so generous with your time. Where can people find you? Is it on Twitter? Are you on Instagram?
I'm on all the socials. I'm on all the socials at roosforflorida.com. So ROOS for Florida, FOR for Florida.com, or at the socials Roos for Florida. And I just want to give a quick shout out to Top Lobster. He's the one who has designed this shirt of King DeSantis, and you can get his merch, this T-shirt at the Top Lobster with a B, LOB.com.
I'll be sure to not only to post that, to link that.
There you go, Danny.
To purchase myself a shirt in a size small. So I'll include links to all of those things. So if you want to contribute to Hector's campaign, there will be a link to do so. If you want to send him a note of support on his Facebook page, please, I encourage you all to do that. As you can see, he's a very knowledgeable candidate, a very viable candidate, I think, in this state, and one who has real political courage, to borrow a word that you used a little bit earlier. And I think that's one of the defining features of libertarians generally. Now, of course, they don't often get the ability to demonstrate that political courage in office. Of course, that's something that we want to see change, just to add a little bit diversity, intellectual diversity, to what has been a rather ossified binary situation for so many years. So can you tell us when the ballots open in Florida?
So election day is the 8th of November, and people can start voting early, 2 weeks before that, on the weekend, starting that weekend. And if you want to vote by mail, they're going to be out in the next 2 or 3 weeks. So you can still have time to actually request a ballot in the mail if you like.
Excellent, excellent. Thank you so much. So if you see that name, ROOS, on the ballot, don't hesitate to check off that box. And if nothing else, send a vote of distaste for the current status quo, if I could say that. Well, Hector, thank you again so much for being so generous with your time. I think this was a fascinating conversation. We covered a lot of topics. Of course, I probably could have talked to you all night and covered a lot more. But again, I think we all learned a lot about libertarianism generally, but you and your campaign specifically, and what you could provide to the state of Florida. So do you have any final remarks?
Just make your presence known, make your opinions known. You participate. There's nothing held against you to doing so. And if enough people just dissent, then things change.
Very well put. Well, with that, I thank you again, Hector. Voting begins in early November, and I bid you all farewell from Finneran's wake.